You are listening to rudolfsteineraudio.com. If you are listening to the podcast of this, it is located at rudolfsteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. As well, we have two publishing houses, steinerbooks.org in America and rudolfsteinerpress.com in London, that are the sole translators of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of a cycle of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled Reimagining Academic Studies. I've read the 7 lectures. This is the 8th part of this, which is a report that Steiner gave, read in Dornach on March 18th. It is translated, this set has been translated by Judith Wormuth Atkinson, and it is Collected Works, Volume 81. Report on the Anthroposophy course at the University of Berlin. Excerpts from the talk given to members in Dornach, March 18, 1922. My dear friends, allow me to say a few words about the way the college course in Berlin went. The program of the course in Berlin was organized in a very special way. The goal was to present the relationship that different scientific fields and different areas of life have to the anthroposophic view of the world. Each single day was dedicated primarily to a particular scientific field or area of life. The week was organized in such a way that we began on Sunday with a topic dedicated to the branch of natural science dealing with inorganic matter. The following Monday was dedicated to the sciences dealing with organic matter and to medicine. Tuesday to philosophy. Wednesday to education, Thursday to political economy, and Friday to theology. Saturday was supposed to be dedicated to linguistics, and we were supposed to round up the whole course on the second Sunday with a Eurythmy presentation in the Deutsches Theater. The program was designed so that each day began with a short lecture given by myself. Only the first Sunday could not begin in this way, because I was not able to be in Berlin on that day. Thus, in my introductory words on Monday, I offered a summary of the sciences dealing with both organic and inorganic matter. The rest of the day maintained the usual character. After my introductory words, in the morning, there were 2 more lectures, and after that we had a half-hour snack break. But, as you have already heard, there were no snacks offered in the rooms of the Vocal Academy. Then from 1 to 2 we had a discussion, followed from 2 to 3 by the last lecture scheduled for the morning. It was an exhausting program. In the evening there were lectures held partly by myself in the Philharmonic Hall and partly by others in the rooms of the University of Berlin. There was 1 lecture every evening, and after each lecture, with the exception of mine, there was some time left for people to express themselves on the topic. As you see, all these days were extremely busy. The structure of the program was very interesting, particularly because of the formulations given to the separate daily programs. To a degree, each day had a general title, and the formulations of these general titles were particularly interesting because they implied some very significant issues. With the exception of Friday, the day dedicated to theology, there was something very positive in the formulation of the title for each day. This already is something important, not so much because it spoke of the spirit of the time, but because it showed the attitude toward anthroposophy of those who created the program. Those who created the other programs felt some pressure to formulate their daily schedules in a positive-sounding way. We could see the importance only by looking at these formulations. Sunday, March 5th, titled From a Mechanical Approach Hostile to Life to True Phenomenology. In the title of this program, we see the expression of hope that through anthroposophy we will find a kind of phenomenology that will represent the foundation of natural science, including its branches dealing with inorganic matter. The morning for Monday was summarized in an even more positive way. Title: Ways of Achieving Anthroposophic Knowledge of the Human Being in Biology and Medicine. The same could be said about the Tuesday program for philosophy, titled Justification of Anthroposophy on the basis of the contemporary philosophical consciousness. Similarly positive was the program for Wednesday, titled From the Modern Pedagogical Requirements to Their Realization Through Anthroposophy. This title also demonstrates the idea that today there are pedagogical requirements that could be fulfilled through Anthroposophy. The formulation of the general title for Thursday, the day dedicated to social sciences, was even more auspicious, though the lectures held on that day were not so promising. The title, however, was extremely hopeful and sounded very positive. Title, Prospects for the National Economy. The title for Sunday, the day dedicated to linguistics, was titled From a Dead to a Living Theory of Language. You can see that all these formulations have as a common basis the intention to show us the ways from our contemporary times into establishing the respective spiritual paths with the help of Anthroposophy. We now have some idea of how different disciplines begin with the existing contemporary scientific formulations, but move toward other ways of cognition, which could be offered by Anthroposophy. In other words, all the sciences have very concrete ideas of alternative approaches. However, on Thursday, as I said, we had a particularly auspicious title, Prospects for the National Economy, an abstract formulation that, precisely in its abstractness, points out that we should not walk, but we should leap, if I may put it this way. If you look now at the general formulation of the title for Friday, you will read title, The Downfall of Religion in Contemporary Theology and Its Redefinition in Anthroposophy. At first, the formulation here appears to be very negative. The downfall of religion in contemporary theology and its redefinition in Anthroposophy. This title points out in a very negative way that there is something like Anthroposophy through which theology and religion could be renewed. However, the title does not explain in any concrete way how we are going to get from the mess in which we are today to an anthroposophic attitude. If you compare this to the formulation of the Sunday topic, titled From a Mechanical Approach Hostile to Life to True Phenomenology, already can be seen in the word phenomenology a very concrete definition of what is supposed to come. The phrase knowledge of the human in the title on Monday also emphasizes something very concrete. The day about philosophy emphasized the philosophical consciousness of our time, another very concrete point. The day on education focused on the requirements of modern times, and the title on the day of linguistics says, titled From a Dead to a Living Theory of Language, a formulation that also leads to very concrete ideas. It is really telling that this college course, which from both an inner and an outer perspective culminated with the performance on Friday and which had basically a theological character, or at least it felt that way, it is telling that this college course, which was very well attended anyway, attracted such a number of people on Friday, on the day of theology, that the room was filled with people to the point of overflowing. It is also telling that precisely the formulation of theology as a topic of the day was the only one in this college course to sound negative. These formulations were certainly based on the existing circumstances, and people tried to formulate the topics in a very honest and direct way, on one hand as a reflection of modern consciousness, and on the other as a reflection of the idea of a transformation of this consciousness through Anthroposophy. If we look now at the individual days, we would certainly see things that we are familiar with to some degree. From a mechanical approach hostile to life to true phenomenology. This is also about making a point that we should overcome all speculations about atomism and about a mechanical conception of inorganic nature. It discusses how we could achieve pure observation of the essence of phenomena, how these phenomena could speak for themselves, and how they could offer their own theories. The idea that we should practice Goetheanism with regard to natural science was clearly expressed in this formulation. In addition, the formulation about the scientific branches dealing with organic nature expresses the fact that we should build our entire scientific conception of organic nature on the basis of our knowledge of the human being. In other words, this title tells us that we must not look at the different kingdoms of nature as if they were broken pieces, as we do today. Rather, we should give priority to the study of the human being, and we should explore the rest of the kingdoms of nature on the basis of that knowledge. Regarding philosophy, the lectures on Tuesday demonstrated that philosophical thought has come to a dead end of sorts. It is interesting to consider this formulation in the context of Hegel, for example. Already in the beginning of the 19th century, Hegel said in his philosophy that all contemporary philosophy is at some kind of an end, and that generally we only could look back at the course of the historical development of philosophy, but that no further development is possible. On that day, Tuesday, a suggestion was made that the end of philosophy could be turned into a beginning, a new beginning, if that beginning is formed in the framework of anthroposophy. The lecture on education emphasized that everyone who is really thinking has some requirements with regard to pedagogy, but that these requirements cannot be fulfilled using the methods that contemporary pedagogy is developing. In other words, the requirements that generally all thinking people have with regard to pedagogy could be fulfilled only with the help of anthroposophy. The lecture on theory of language demonstrated that language itself should not be perceived as something found in dead documents, as the case is in contemporary linguistics, but that it has to be perceived as a living organism and in relation to the human being. About social science, I can say only that Emil Leinhaus made very important points about today's financial problem in a very competent and very positive way. However, as you yourselves must feel sometimes, we cannot say very many positive things about today's financial problem. You can feel this even here in Switzerland, the country with almost the highest currency value. But you can certainly believe that we cannot say many positive things about today's financial problem if we cross the border. In brief, we cannot say many positive things at all. The following two lectures did not mention anything positive, and this day dedicated to the national economy showed that the way we treat the national economy within our anthroposophic movement has failed over and over. Despite the fact that precisely with regard to this area we have repeatedly emphasized the necessity for those who have insight into our economic life to come up with something more certain about the future of political economy. Basically, we have not been able to offer any ideas that could satisfy the requirements of our present time. In this sense, the title of that day, Prospects for the National Economy, represented an attempt to dance with a promise. What the day actually brought about, however, was more or less a crippled partner limping after the dancer. Regarding theology, I should say that the titles of the three lectures, following my introductory discourse, were as interesting as the formulation of the program for this day. The title of the first lecture by Licentiate Bach was titled The Fall of Religion into Psychologism. The title of Dr. Riddlemeyer's lecture was The Fall of Theology into Irrationalism. And the third lecture given by Dr. Geyer was entitled The Fall of Theology into Historicism. So, in these few days we heard three different descriptions of the downfall of theology or religion. In a way, the situation today resulted naturally in the fact that it was theologians who, on the basis of their very specific experience in thinking and feeling, described how they have come to a dead end in theology. If we remember then the positive things we heard on that day, we could summarize the lectures on that day in the following way. The way theology looks at religion, according to Licentiate Bach, leads to seeing only the experience of the soul, defined as religious experience or as an experience of God. We find that among other experiences of the soul, the human being has also some religious experience or some kind of an experience that somehow points at the divine. However, if we are unbiased toward this experience, we could say, yes, this is simply a subjective experience, a purely psychological experience. We cannot find any proof that there is anything in the objective world that corresponds to this experience. In modern theology, the subjective experience of God does not lead to the real acceptance of God, and certainly not to a particular view of the nature of the divine in the world. To a certain degree, the religious element in human consciousness is suffocated by the psychological fact that, yes, we need some religious life, but there is nothing that can give us an assurance that this need could be satisfied. The psychological fact that the human being needs religion is given, but our times do not know how to give religion some content. This was approximately the conclusion in the first lecture by Licentiate Bach. After that, Dr. Rittlemeyer explained why theology had enough of rationalism, and how it had come to the point when it did not any longer want to be defining the essence of God in the world of thought, when it did not want any longer to say that this or that is the content of the divine that penetrates the entire existence of the world. Thought had to be excluded from theology. Rationality and everything else based on reason had to be taken out. Instead, the irrational, everything that excludes intellectual thought, is supposed to become the content of theology. In other words, theology is supposed to deal exclusively with the most superficial abstractions. We do not dare say that God's being could be grasped through thought. We dare say only that God's being is the unconditional, the absolute. Thus we construct a completely abstract concept, the irrational, something that cannot be grasped by reason. Is it not true that in any other area it would seem very strange to characterize things in such negative terms? Imagine, for example, that someone asks who the head of the Goetheanum is, and the answer is someone who is not head of any other institution. In this case, we will have no information about who really is the head of the Goetheanum. Similarly, we cannot get any idea about the divine when we say that the rationale of the divine being consists of the fact that God is something irrational that cannot be grasped by reason. All of this is only negating. Rittlemeyer established a connection between these explanations and what contemporary irrationalists have to say. For example, what the inner behavior of people is who are trying to elevate themselves to this God who could be understood only in an irrational way. What is one's experience of such an attempt? It is a silent experience. However, this is not the silence in a mystical experience, which could be very positive. This is rather the point of not saying anything, of ceasing to speak in thoughts, even to oneself. We heard further how this silence grows roots into the ritual. In fact, the reason to seek refuge in silence is the absolute inability to formulate just about anything. Later, it was interesting to hear two gentlemen, a professor and a priest, who were defending this irrationalism and were trying to prove particularly that irrationalism is predominant in our time. The professor, for example, said, yes, this is right. It would be silly to say that God could be figured out only in the spirit but not in nature. Nature is not further away from God than the spirit. He also said that with regard to God, the knowledge of the spirit does not offer more than the knowledge of nature, for God is the unconditional that penetrates everything. He was repeating this statement frequently, namely that God is the unconditional that penetrates everything. Theology, Faust would use here the word alas, not once but 3 times. Faust's lines, philosophy and jurisprudence, medicine, and even alas, 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 theology, should be rewritten if we get to hear such statements all the time. God is the unconditional that penetrates everything. We imagine what is called everything, and then something appears, something surfaces, but this something is actually the undefined. The last lecture was given by Dr. Geyer. He was talking about the downfall of theology into historicism. Geyer was trying to demonstrate how theology has gradually reached the point when it cannot come up with any creative ideas on its own, when it can only observe what has already passed. In other words, in order to discover some content, it emphasizes the constant study of history or of what has already passed. Naturally, this approach leads us, in the best case, to the possibility of saying, in the past, people had religious consciousness, but today they are only able to analyze the different stages of past religious consciousness and to choose something that they still would like to preserve. Unfortunately, when they try to choose, they find that there is nothing left of what the different epochs in the past offered them. I myself introduced this program with a remark that Anthroposophy certainly does not try to found a religion, but wants to achieve the cognition of the suprasensory world instead. Thus, if theology wants to be inspired by it, this will be very welcome. Anthroposophy will say what it has to say about the suprasensory world, and in its own turn, it will wait to see what use it could make of theology. Those who have a sense for the complex situation of our times noticed a deficiency, particularly on that day, which, however, resulted from the circumstances. If we were supposed to exhaust the topic of the day completely, as we tried to do, and that we achieved to a certain degree with the rest of the daily topics, with the exception of the topic on social science, then we should have had a Catholic theologian speak as well. All of the lectures that were held on that day were grounded in Protestant consciousness. A Catholic theologian would have been in a completely different position than the three Protestant speakers. A Catholic theologian is well served not only by a theology that is historically inherited, but by a theology that is historically inherited and eternally valid, a theology that is supposed to be as alive today as it was in the 3rd or the 2nd century A.D. The church councils and the institution of the Pope, which became infallible in the 19th century, have added something to that theology. However, this was only about particular dogmas, about additions. The essence of Catholic theology is in fact something that firstly does not depend on the developments in different times, and that secondly should have a perennial or everlasting character. If a more progressive Catholic had spoken about Catholic theology, he probably would have been in a very interesting opposition to the struggle of a Catholic thinker such as Cardinal Neumann. If a less progressive Catholic theologian had spoken, he would have presented the essence of the everlasting doctrine of salvation or a Catholic theology. Then people would have had questions of great importance, as for example the question, what does Catholic theology bring to people of today? There is no doubt that in its present state, Catholic theology cannot offer any living ideas to modern consciousness. Its content is rooted exclusively in the experience of old spiritual, if even atavistic, knowledge. The concepts of which Catholic theology consists, such as the creation or redemption, or the essence of the Trinity, all those concepts have some essence, but their essence cannot be comprehended any longer by the modern consciousness. Instead, they are transformed into abstract, incomprehensible dogmatism, unless they are not even transformed, but are simply accepted as incomprehensible, dry dogmatism. Especially in the 19th century, Catholic theology developed in a way that made it impossible to recognize what the contents of the different dogmas contained. During the college course in Berlin, we had an interesting experience related to this. In my introductory remarks on Friday, I said something that was based on my immediate experience, and which I had already mentioned to you. I said, unless they are crippled, those who can experience our immediate natural environment and everything related to it will come to the consciousness of God the Father. If during the course of their lives some of them find the experience of God the Father unsatisfactory and come to some kind of an inner rebirth, they will experience God the Son, or the Son of God. In the very same way, if we continue taking further steps, we will come to the experience of the Holy Ghost. To this a Protestant professor, Licentiate Tillich, made a remark. Aha! Here is the Trinity that has to be constructed, and he called the fact a construction. He did not notice at all that at the basis of all this is experience. This was alien to him. The experiences that were at the basis of the Catholic dogmas were also alien to the modern consciousness of the 19th century. Originally, the Catholic dogmas were certainly based on spiritual reality too, but today we do not understand this reality any longer. We deal simply with empty concepts. In the 19th century, Catholic theology had to revive its content at least a little bit, even if only superficially. You may well know that the desire to be able to understand again, at least a little bit, appeared particularly strong under the pontificate of Leo XIII. This is why we had the Catholic Ordinance, or shall I say the Ordinance of Rome, for all Catholic theologians to go back to the study of the Thomistic philosophy, the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, since the entire philosophy after him was no longer useful for the understanding of the Catholic dogmas. In order to give natural science its foundations, the philosophy following that of Thomas Aquinas can help us only to understand the existence of nature. It cannot help us understand spiritual facts, which Catholics do not understand well either, but which were formulated in the Catholic dogmas at a time when people still knew something about those facts. The entire later post-Thomistic philosophy is useless in the attempt to understand these spiritual facts. When people felt again the desire to understand some of the Catholic dogmas, Rome requested the renewed study of Thomistic philosophy, the real endeavor of Roman Catholicism regarding philosophy until today. There are certainly historical reasons for that. However, if we draw a comparison to the needs we have today in order to come back to spirituality, we will see that Thomism is not enough to revive the old rigid Roman dogmas. We have to come to a completely different observation. Please remember my view that Hamlet is a student of Faust, regardless of time and space, a view I presented to you in my last few lectures before I left Dornoch, and which a contemporary literary historian would find completely perverse. I said that Hamlet must have been sitting at Faust's feet for 10 years, for the same 10 years when Faust was leading his students by the nose, and that Hamlet must have been one of those students who was led by the nose in all possible directions. Such connections are appalling to any contemporary literary historian, but today we cannot say anything significant about the spiritual that will not be appalling for the official representatives of the sciences. Today the stigma of the real truth is exactly what appalls the public representatives of the sciences. So if you take this interpretation for something profane, you will see that we need to achieve a certain mobility of the spirit, a mobility that could offer a foundation for the understanding of the essence preserved in the dogmas. You will realize that we have to go back to a completely different state of the psyche in order to learn the art of living within such dogmas, and this shows precisely the process of the development of Cardinal Neumann. In Berlin today, it may be very normal to speak in a college course like this only from the perspective of Protestantism, and to ignore the Catholic standpoint. However, we are not going to get the picture of what is really predominant today if we are not capable of discussing the Catholic perspective in some way. Exactly in our time, when we need to look at the entire world as a whole, this is impossible. Today, you see, we have overcome the speaking of church tower science, of church tower worldviews alone. You already know the church tower politics, but there is also such a thing as church tower worldviews. We are confronted with it in a powerful way, especially when we experience something like Dr. Teberat's lecture on Friday, for example, when he spoke on the topic, atomistic and realistic approaches to chemical processes. Dr. Teberat, who is employed in our research institute in Stuttgart, tried to show that atomism has to be abandoned and that phenomenology should be introduced into chemistry. Dr. Kurt Grayling entered the debate too. At this point, I do not wish to talk about Dr. Kurt Grayling, who carried on with approximately the following prescription. Yes, the anthroposophists talk about just about everything, but none of it seems to me very likely. What is certain is that 2 + 2 = 4, and we should stick to what is certain. 2 + 2 = 4. This is certain. Close quote. He asserted this opinion already last summer in the course in Stuttgart, and on one particular evening he even brought 2 more university professors to support his assertion that 2 + 2 = 4. One could not argue with him. By mentioning this, I would like only to suggest symbolically what he said, namely that 2 + 2 is really 4. I could not argue against it. I could not argue even last Friday when he said completely out of context that in Stuttgart I admitted that 2 + 2 = 4. I certainly cannot deny that. I don't mean now literally 2 + 2 = 4. I am talking about things that he discussed back then, and which are equally valuable in the broader context. Then he said, yes, regarding the question raised here, the question of phenomenology, we should say that we cannot make judgments about it from the point of view of natural science. We have to judge it from the point of view of philosophy. I do not wish to say that this is a typical attitude for Göttingen, but this statement was at least not very sophisticated or scientific. In England, for example, no one would understand a statement that says that we cannot judge something from the point of view of science, but only from the point of view of philosophy, because this is precisely what a church tower worldview is. Only particular Central European circles would know what this statement means. In any event, when we speak of questions like that today, we need a much wider horizon. For example, we cannot possibly keep talking about East, West, and the center between them. The formulations in the program for the Congress in Vienna repeat constantly the words East, West, and Central, and I do not object. I think that talking about East, West, and Central is in the spirit of great ideas. But I believe that our concepts should be a bit broader, and that they should really cover those regions. We surely cannot embrace the entire world by looking at it from a narrow-minded perspective. Thus, in the lectures on religion and theology in Berlin, there was something missing, for example, with regard to the Western development of religious life, because Catholicism was completely ignored, even though there is nothing tangible in the Western religious life, if we look at it only from the Protestant perspective. We did not even touch upon the question of the development of English Puritanism or the High Church. I do not mean to criticize all this, since the points that we did discuss were excellent. However, in our close anthroposophic circle, I would like to talk about the issues that should have been mentioned in relation to the discussed processes. In such relation, it should have been demonstrated how our contemporary way of thinking is not capable at all of even approaching the old sources of theological content. In Berlin, we did not see any bridge between modern evangelical theology and the ideas that anthroposophy should offer to revive religious consciousness. There were only references to the fact that these ideas should come from anthroposophy, but basically nothing was said about the way all this should materialize. This will probably give you an idea of the struggle in the arena of anthroposophy that recently found its most beautiful expression in Berlin. The lectures, even the morning lectures, attracted a very large audience, and thus the participation of various different circles showed that there is some life in the anthroposophic movement, a life that appeals strongly and with great intensity to contemporary human consciousness. At the same time, we did not spare sharp phrases that could characterize the truth. It gives me some inner joy to remember that on Sunday evening, Dr. Schubert tried to show, within the framework of the topic Anthroposophy and Theory of Language, that language plays a role in the political life of peoples and races, and that during the debate he passionately explained what language theory is today and what it should become with the help of Anthroposophy. He was very passionate when he said that, yes, he had been in Berlin, that he has studied linguistics with various professors, and then he turned to Anthroposophy to give life to the linguistics he had studied. Only then did he have a revelation, and he understood what contemporary linguistics really is, a piece of garbage. And then he slammed the table with his fist. So he was very generous with the phrases characterizing our time. The opponents were not much better. I cannot avoid saying that they were passionate, so I would rather not say anything. During the evening panels, some people tried to offer some idea of what the content of Anthroposophy is. It was very important that both Dr. Stein and Dr. Schwebsch showed vivid images illustrating the pedagogical effect achieved in the Waldorf school. What I want to say is that we could experience some remarkable moments just reading between the lines. The course closed on Sunday. I gave the closing lecture on the last evening, and the morning panels ended with an extremely successful performance of Eurythmy in the Deutsches Theater, which was filled to the last seat. I do not need to say that if you get hold of any newspaper, you will read the opposite of what really happened in Berlin. However, there is a gentleman who had written an article in one of the Berlin newspapers, and his article was considered to be pro-Anthroposophy. I do not wish to express an opinion about this. The same person then asked another big newspaper whether he could write an article about the college course in Berlin. They asked him pro or against. He answered pro, because he thought that his article would be pro-Anthroposophy. Then the newspaper people said, "No, we take only articles against it." This means that no one cares what people write about Anthroposophy. Rather, they buy only articles against it. Consequently, if you read any outsider's reports, you will not get any idea of what really happened in Berlin. It is a pity that except for the performance in the Deutsches Theater and the short performances on Thursday and Sunday, there were no more Eurythmy performances. Because following the example of the Anthroposophic Congress in Stuttgart, they could have helped the overwhelmed participants to take the burden of those fully occupied days somewhat better. I can imagine that it was very hard. Think, for example, of any one of those days, say an average day, when we did not have additional meetings for more people. On such a day, someone who participated in all the panels would have heard 5 lectures and 1 discussion. It is too much for people today to listen to 5 lectures and 1 discussion. In fact, on a normal day, there were 2 discussions. This means that we had the opportunity to live continually with such thoughts from 9 to 3, and then again from 8 until 10:30 in the evening. It would have been certainly much better if there had been some short Eurythmy performances in between, just for a change, as they did in Stuttgart. Overall, however, the result was significant. That is the end of the report, or part 8, of Reimagining Academic Studies in Science, Philosophy, Theology, Education, Social Science, Theory of Language by Rudolf Steiner, and the end of the book.